Imagine a heavy silence taking over everything. The body was placed in the tomb. The stone was closed. The soldiers stood guard. For many, the story of name ended there, Jesus Christ. But it is precisely at this moment that something unsettling begins. Because, as he himself had warned, death would not be the end. It would be the beginning of a sequence of events so powerful, so real, and so visible in history that they would span centuries and change the destiny of the entire world. The most frightening thing is that nothing happened by chance. Wars, the fall of cities, persecutions, the changing of empires, and even the growth of a faith that no one could stop, all of this had already been foretold. And the more time passed, the more the facts began to confirm these words, not as legends, not as metaphors, but as real events recorded by history and felt by humanity. Padre Pio, he said something that sends shivers down your spine just hearing it. The cross didn't silence Jesus. It activated what would come after. For him, anyone who observes the world attentively notices that many things that happened after that death follow a frightening pattern, a pattern that seems to have been foretold in advance. And here arises the question that captivates the mind of anyone, even a curious child. If so many things happen exactly as predicted, are we merely remembering the past, or are we looking for signs that still speak to the present? Because some of these prophecies not only came true, they left deep marks on the history of humanity. In this video, you'll understand why Jesus' death didn't end anything. On the contrary, it opened a sequence of real documented events that are impossible to ignore. And the further you go, the more you realize that the scariest part isn't what has already happened, but what these prophecies might still mean. It all begins with a simple but powerful promise. Before dying, Jesus Christ, he said something that seemed impossible, that he would die, be placed in a tomb, and after 3 days would return to life. To those who heard it at the time, it sounded like madness. After all, no one conquers death. But it was precisely there that the first prophecy began to frighten the world. After the crucifixion, Jesus' body was placed in a sealed tomb with a large stone. Soldiers stood guard to ensure nothing happened. Everything seemed over. The disciples were afraid, hiding, thinking they had lost everything. The silence of that place seemed definitive. But 3 days later, something unexpected happened. The tomb was empty. And here's the detail that grabs your attention. If the body had been stolen, the story would have ended there. They could have simply presented it. But that never happened. On the contrary, people started saying they saw him alive. Different people in different places at different times. Some of these people didn't even believe in him before. Others even doubted until they saw it with their own eyes. This prophecy is not merely a religious account. It is the starting point for everything that came after. It was the empty tomb that transformed fear into courage. It was what made simple men face imprisonment and death without denying what they had seen. No one dies for something they know to be a lie. That's what makes this first prophecy so impactful. It's not just the resurrection itself, but the real effect it had on the world. A message that should have died there spread like wildfire. And it all began with a tomb that couldn't contain the one who had been placed inside it. And when you understand this, an inevitable question arises. If this prophecy was fulfilled so clearly, what about the others that came after? After Jesus Christ, he died, and something strange began to happen. Instead of the story ending, as many expected, it became even more dangerous. Before all this, Jesus had already warned his followers, "You will be persecuted because of me." At that moment, few understood the weight of those words, but it didn't take long for them to become reality. Immediately after Jesus' death, his disciples lived in fear. They hid, spoke in hushed tones, and constantly changed locations. This was no imagination. People who claimed to believe in him began to be arrested, beaten, and even killed. Following Jesus became a reason for punishment. Families were separated, friends disappeared. All of this happened exactly as had been foretold. The most curious and, at the same time, frightening thing is that this persecution did not make the faith disappear. It did the opposite. The more they tried to silence those people, the more they spoke. The more they forbade, the more the message spread. This is not a legend. It is a historical fact. The Roman Empire persecuted Christians for decades, and yet it could not stop the growth of the faith. Here's a detail that would capture the attention of even a curious child. If those people were lying, they would have given up at the first sign of danger, but they continued. Some knew they could die, and yet they didn't deny what they believed they had seen. This shows that something very powerful had happened beforehand. This prophecy is impactful because it speaks not only of suffering but of resistance. Jesus warned that following his teachings would come at a price, and it did. But he also showed that neither fear nor violence would be enough to erase what had already been planted. And when you realize that this persecution happened exactly as predicted, an inevitable question arises. If even suffering was foretold, what else was yet to come? Even before being arrested, Jesus Christ, he made a statement that sounded impossible to those who heard him. He said that Jerusalem would be destroyed, that the great temple, the most sacred place of that people, would be brought down, and that not a stone would be left upon another. To many, this seemed like an exaggeration. Jerusalem was strong, protected, and full of history. No one believed that something like that could happen, but time passed, and the prophecy began to take shape. About 40 years after the death of Jesus, in the year 70 AD, the Roman Empire besieged Jerusalem. The city was invaded, burned, and destroyed. The temple, which was the religious heart of the Jewish people, was completely razed. Nothing remained, exactly as it had been said. This fact comes not only from the Bible, but also from Roman and Jewish historical records. What's most frightening is to think that when Jesus said this, nothing indicated that Jerusalem would fall in that way. On the contrary, the city seemed safe. People felt protected by its walls and by their faith. But none of these things prevented what was to come. Imagine the impact this had on those who remembered Jesus' words. What had previously seemed like just a distant warning became a reality before everyone's eyes. An entire city destroyed, a temple that was never rebuilt, a landmark that forever changed the history of that people. This prophecy doesn't just speak of stones and buildings. It shows that major, painful, and real events had already been announced long before they happened. And when something so specific comes true in this way, it becomes impossible to ignore. And then a question arises that grabs attention. If an entire city fell exactly as predicted, what about the other prophecies that came after that, after the death of Jesus? Christ, something began to happen that no one from that time could have imagined. Before leaving, he made a simple but bold statement. His message would reach all nations of the world. At that moment, this seemed impossible. Jesus didn't write books, didn't command armies, and never left that small region. His followers were few, simple, and without any power. But it was precisely after his death that this prophecy began to be fulfilled. Ordinary men began traveling to distant places, crossing seas, deserts, and unknown cities. They spoke about Jesus to people of different cultures, different languages, and completely different customs. There was no internet, television, or fast means of communication. Even so, the message continued to spread. The most curious and frightening at the same time thing is that no one managed to stop it. Governments tried to block it. Authorities prohibited it. People mocked it. Yet faith continued to grow. Centuries later, Christianity was present on entire continents. Today, history confirms it. Billions of people in the world know the name of Jesus. Think about it calmly, like a curious child would. How did a message that began with a crucified man manage to cross centuries, wars, empires, and borders? The answer is simple and at the same time impressive, because it had already been announced. This prophecy isn't just about religion, It's about reach, about something small that becomes gigantic, about an idea that should have died along with its leader but did exactly the opposite. It grew, it spread, it touched the entire world. And when you realize that this promise has been fulfilled so clearly, a feeling arises that is hard to ignore. If this message truly reached all nations as it was said, are we still feeling the effects of this prophecy today? After the death of Jesus Christ, something happened that no one could explain with logic alone. Men filled with fear, who had previously hidden themselves, began to act like completely different people. Jesus had already warned that this would happen. Those who were weak would become strong, and those who fled would begin to bear witness without fear. The clearest example of this is Peter. Shortly before the crucifixion, he denied Jesus 3 times out of sheer fear. The mere threat of being recognized was enough to make him back down. He seemed incapable of facing any danger. But after the death and resurrection, this same man began to speak publicly, before crowds, saying exactly what he believed. He was arrested, threatened, and beaten, and yet he did not recant. And Peter wasn't the only one. Other followers, who were previously fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary people, began to confront authorities, imprisonment, and even death, without denying what they had seen. This is not religious exaggeration, it is historical fact. People who had nothing to gain and everything to lose chose to remain steadfast. Here a simple question arises, one that even a child understands. Why would someone change so much if it were all a lie? No one faces pain, loss, and death for something they know isn't true. This radical transformation is one of the most impressive prophecies because it didn't happen just once. It happened to many people. Jesus had said that his followers would be transformed, that they would receive courage when they needed it most. And that is exactly what happened. Fear turned into strength. Silence became voice. Flight turned into courage. And when you notice such a profound change in real people of flesh and blood, it becomes impossible to ignore. Something very powerful was activated after the death of Jesus. Something that changed ordinary people and little by little began to change the whole world. After the death of Jesus Christ, one of the most impressive events in history began to unfold over the years. Jesus had warned that those who persecuted him would not remain forever. At the time, this seemed impossible to imagine. The Roman Empire was strong, dominated immense lands, and seemed indestructible. How could a small group of followers survive something so powerful? But history has shown something surprising. Initially, the Roman Empire harshly persecuted Christians. People were imprisoned, thrown into arenas, and killed simply for believing in Jesus. It seemed that this faith would be erased by force. However, the exact opposite happened. The more the empire tried to destroy Jesus' followers, the more they grew in number and conviction. Over time, something unbelievable happened. The same empire that persecuted Jesus and his followers began to change. Centuries later, Rome stopped fighting Christianity and began to accept it. Later, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. This is not legend. It is recorded historical fact. Now think about it like a child would. How did a giant empire fall while the message of a crucified man remained alive? The Roman Empire, which seemed eternal, declined, divided, and fell. But the message of Jesus has crossed centuries, empires, and borders. This prophecy is frightening because it shows a complete reversal of power. Those who seemed strong disappeared over time. Those who seemed weak remained. Jesus did not use armies, did not raise weapons, but his word stood firm when the thrones crumbled. And when you realize that entire empires have passed away, and the message proclaimed after Jesus' death remains alive to this day, an inevitable question arises. If even the greatest powers in the world couldn't withstand it, what truly has the strength to endure? After the death of Jesus Christ, the world has entered a seemingly endless phase. Before all this happened, Jesus had already warned that after his departure, humanity would face difficult times. He spoke of wars, conflicts, divisions among people, nations fighting each other, and a constant feeling of fear spreading throughout the world. To those who heard it at the time, it seemed like an exaggeration, but history has shown otherwise. Soon after, wars began to spread. Peoples fought against peoples, kingdoms clashed, centuries passed, and this never stopped. Humanity has lived through increasingly larger, more violent and more destructive wars. And it wasn't just wars. Jesus also spoke of crises, famine, suffering, and people living with hearts full of fear. All of this became part of the history of the world. What's most striking is realizing that these events didn't happen all at once, but have been repeating themselves generation after generation. When one war ends, another begins. When a period seems calm, something new emerges to bring instability. This makes many people wonder, why does the world never find peace for very long? Jesus explained that these conflicts would not be a sign that everything was over, but that the world would go through constant suffering. It was as if it were a warning so that people wouldn't be deceived into thinking that everything would always be all right. And when we observe the past and the present, we realize that this makes sense. Even a child can understand this part. Just look around. The world always faces problems. There are always fights, injustices, and fear. None of this appeared out of nowhere. It had already been foretold. This prophecy is frightening because it doesn't just speak of the past, but seems to describe what we still see today. And when you realize that these words continue to make sense, so many centuries later, a question arises that grabs your attention. If these conflicts were already predicted, could they still be part of something bigger that many people don't realize? Centuries after the death of Jesus Christ, just when many thought all of this was a thing of the past, a voice emerged that captured the world's attention once more. That voice was that of Padre Pio, a man known for his simple life, deep faith, and warnings that made people reflect with fear and curiosity at the same time. Father Pio said something very unsettling. The prophecies linked to Jesus were not just ancient stories, but living signs scattered throughout history. For him, everything that happened after Jesus' death served as proof that nothing was a coincidence. Wars, persecutions, the fall of empires, human crises, everything followed a path that had already been foretold. The most striking point is that Padre Pio wasn't saying these things to frighten people without reason. He was warning them as if to say, observe the world. According to him, when people ignore the signs of the past, they end up repeating the same mistakes. And the events that marked humanity after the death of Jesus were for him clear reminders that the words spoken centuries before continued to be fulfilled. Even a child can understand this idea. Imagine someone warning you that if you don't pay attention, you'll fall. Then you fall. The warning wasn't meant to scare you, but to protect you. Padre Pio saw prophecies in the same way, a warning that many people prefer not to hear. He said that the most frightening thing was not what had already happened, but people's indifference to it all. Because when real facts confirm old sayings, ignoring them can be dangerous. For Padre Pio, looking at history was like looking in a mirror. And when you put all of this together, a feeling that's hard to explain emerges. If so many things happened exactly as predicted, are those warnings still speaking to the world today, when we put together everything that has happened since the death of Jesus Christ? We've reached a point that sends shivers down your spine. Many prophecies have been announced, and many have already been fulfilled before the eyes of history. The empty tomb, the persecution of followers, the destruction of Jerusalem, the expansion of faith, the fall of empires, the wars and suffering of the world. All of this is not isolated in time. It forms a sequence, and that's where the most unsettling part comes in. If so many prophecies have been fulfilled exactly as predicted, it means that the story is not yet over. Jesus made it clear that not everything would happen at once. Some things would come soon, others would take centuries, and some would be underway, happening gradually before generations that may not even realize it. Even a child can understand this idea. Imagine a book being read slowly. Some pages have already been turned, others are yet to come. The fact that we have already read several pages does not mean that the story is over. It only means that it continues. Padre Pio warned precisely about that. For him, looking at fulfilled prophecies was a way of understanding that the warnings were real, and that ignoring what has already happened would be closing one's eyes to what may still happen. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. The scariest thing isn't thinking of the future as something mysterious. The scariest thing is realizing that the past confirms words spoken long before everything happened. This makes anyone wonder, are we just remembering old stories, or living part of something that is still unfolding? This is the final point that captivates the mind. If so many prophecies have been fulfilled with such precision, perhaps the most important question is not what has already happened, but rather, what are we still experiencing without realizing it? Because when history speaks, so loudly ignoring it can be the greatest risk of all. If everything you've heard so far has been confirmed by history, then this isn't just another old story. It's a warning that has spanned centuries. Every prophecy fulfilled after the death of Jesus Christ, it shows us that nothing happened by chance, and that understanding the past can be the key to understanding the present. Now I want to know from you, which of these prophecies impressed you the most or made you reflect? Write in the comments, because your opinion is part of this conversation and can help others see details that may have gone unnoticed. Subscribe to the channel to avoid missing upcoming videos, where we'll continue revealing real facts, historical records, and messages that few dare to explain. Turn on notifications. What comes next could completely change how you look at history and the world today.
Hear the true prophetic message.